Gentlemen, we now have a session on Islam and values of Islam being used in foreign policy. And speaking about that, I think Islam is a statecraft, geopolitics of religion, soft power, moderate Islam, all these things will be addressed in our session. So I will just briefly introduce the speakers. Talmiz Ahmed, who's a former Indian ambassador, on my left, and Professor Kingshuk Chatterjee, who's Associate Professor of Calcutta University, and Professor Dewey Fortuno Anwar, Professor at the Center for Political Studies, Institute of Sciences, Indonesia. So without much ado, we will start with, why don't you start? Kingshuk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to begin by thanking ICRIA for getting me back again on this conference on this topic and asking me to talk about the same thing, because it gives me the opportunity to share with you some questions that I had while I was reflecting on the problem before we got about writing it, me and my co-author. And all morning and the early part of the afternoon that I have been hearing, I think the questions still need to be asked. So what I would like to do, if you would indulge in me, to take you back to the drawing board. We have been talking about values all morning, and my question is very simply this: how do you read values? Interests are defined by a number of interest groups, perhaps. Governments then sort of showcase those things. Values to be done the same. So my paper, for want of a better word, I'll still call it a paper, is essentially comprised of 4 broad sets of questions and possible responses to these that you may have when we look at the role Islamic values are meant to play in shaping foreign policy. There is nothing definitely conclusive, I would argue, because definitive conclusions are not possible in this matter, for I would say that the phenomenon of Islamic politics is too young. It's essentially a 20th century phenomenon, and in the shape and form we have it is a late 20th century phenomenon. As a historian, I think it's better to resort to the pathological approach to things, look at things after they have stopped developing. And I would argue that Islamic politics is still in the process of evolution. Hence the questions. The first question that I ask is a very basic one. What makes values, certain values, Islamic? Is it the vintage, or is it the objectives? Are Islamic values to be espoused by Muslims and Muslims alone? Or can values be espoused by Muslims among others, and so long as they are in consonance to some basic readings or some particular readings of Islam, can be understood as Islamic values? But then, if either of these were to be the case, that Islamic values to be espoused would have to be espoused by Muslims of all things, of all other people, can Islamic values be espoused by non-Muslim countries as well? To give you an example, one common set of values that is often projected is that there has to be a solidarity among all the Muslim communities, so that there is the global Islamic Ummah, the Muslim community as a whole, would be standing shoulder to shoulder on most issues. If this was to be the case, then a number of Muslim countries standing for questions like Palestine, raising questions like Kashmir, like the Rohingyas in Myanmar, can be easily explained. But how do you explain the US resorting to the same questions about the rights of repressed people such as in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Muslim world was certainly vocal in their criticism of what was happening over there, but it was the US, after all, who landed up and sorted the matter out somewhat. If to be the savior of Muslims everywhere is to be a part of the fulfillment of duty of a Muslim ummah, then should the US also be included within the larger frame? Can non-Muslim values be made Islamic? So can values that were identified all this morning as Western, can they be Islamized? I'll give you an example. When the Islamic Revolution took place in Iran in 1979, one of the major criticisms that the Islamic regime was posing of its neighboring countries, especially of Saudi Arabia, is that unlike Iran in 1979, they claimed Saudi Arabia was unrepresentative. Representative politics is, for want of any more concrete evidence, we will say it's an idea borrowed from the Western world. So can a non-Islamic idea be Islamized over a period of time? In the light of this first question as to what makes values Islamic, I would like to ask the second set of questions. Is there any such things as Islamic values in foreign policy at all? If foreign policy goals that are embraced in the name of Islam are to be considered as Islamic, just prima facie, that simply because they are claimed to be policies espoused in the name of Islam, they must be Islamic in their inspiration, such as I said, the example of the question of solidarity with Muslims who are believed to be oppressed around the world. You can actually argue that most of these causes are espoused for real political considerations also. So is it interests, as it was being argued all morning in contraposition to values? Or is it values? Can they coexist? Can they be independent of each other? Can they be in contradiction with each other? These are things that need to be threshed out and have not been done. The other position on this question of whether there is any such thing as Islamic values in foreign policy is that foreign policy goals that are geopolitical, geostrategic, can always be couched in the name of Islam. So let's say in the case of Rohingyas, or in the case of Kashmir, or case of Afghanistan, not everyone espouses the cases uniformly. There were times when New Delhi's relations with Tehran was not good, and in those junctures, Tehran was critical of what was happening in Kashmir. At other times when relations were improving, Tehran was much less critical of Kashmir. Is this voicing Islamic solidarity, or is it simply appearing to do that? The third set of questions that I have in mind is to account for the differences in policies of Muslim countries. If you would accept Islamic values to be inspired by Islam, the faith, then shouldn't they be uniform across the Muslim world? If they are the same across the Muslim world, then one of the Quranic injunctions would say that the Muslims should not fight each other. Do you mean to say there are no wars among Muslim countries? And if there have been, how have they been? The case of Iran-Iraq war is very good. Both Iraq and Iran denounced each other of being extremely un-Islamic in their espousal of belligerence. One answer for this kind of question, of course, is the polyvalency of Islam. That Islam does not mean any one thing. It means different things along sectarian lines, perhaps also according to geopolitical, geostrategic, and historical conjunctures in which it is interpreted as something. It has to be, what I'm trying to argue is Islamic values have to be read in the context in which those values are being touted as of significance. Because Islam is, after all, a political language. It has an instrumental value, and while some people would argue it also has an essential value, as social scientists, I think we are in general agreement. I don't know about the diplomats, plead my ignorance. social scientists are generally in agreement that the essence is a matter of interpretation, just as Ambassador Burleigh's interpretation of the essence of Americanism is completely different from that of Mr. Trump. And this can be very easily explained, again, of this instrumental value of it, with respect to, say, Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War. If Muslim countries are not meant to fight each other, then Saudi Arabia very happily allowed the United States armed forces use their facilities in the region and even partly bankrolled the development. How does this square up with Saudi Arabia's claim to be the custodian of the twin holy sites of Islam? Is that interest triumphing over values, or whether it's values being showcased differently? So Saudi Arabia was criticizing what the Saddam regime was doing in Kuwait as patently un-Islamic. Islam can be interpreted freely depending by what you want to make as your argument. The last set of questions that I have in mind, or the last question I have in mind, is that is it necessary for predominantly Muslim countries to have Islamic values informing foreign policy? Can you be a Muslim country without having without drawing any inspiration from Islamic values at all? There could be two answers to this. One is that yes, it is necessary for predominantly Muslim countries to have Islamic values because of the vintage question. It has to be, it must be done by Muslims. It must be, policy is adopted by Muslims. If the language of politics in a country is Islamic, then Islamic values are instrumental in nature. And for any kind of interest that you want to push, it is useful, not necessarily necessary, but it is useful to couch them in Islamic terms of reference. However, if the language of politics in a Muslim country is not Islamic, and Muslims do not necessarily have to seek validation or inspiration from Islam, then you can patently well have Muslim countries which do not follow Islamic values in the foreign policy. They just follow their real political considerations. Personally, I am inclined to be of the instrumentalist school. I believe that religion or religious values are useful for mobilizing people in order to look for public legitimacy if, for some reason in a particular society, those values are valorized. But as I said, no definitive conclusions I have to offer, and I'm perfectly happy to debate on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, may I ask Yiwei Anwar to please take on the dais? Thank you.
Can I just sit here? If I go on the podium, I tend to go on and on and on.
Yes, if that's what you want. Please do go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. The questions about what exactly are Islamic values. There's actually a very learned Muslim scholar who crystallized, what are really the Islamic values and list them, and which are the countries that practice them. And it turns out that the only countries in the world that practice true Islamic values are but 4, 3 of them in Scandinavia and 1 of them in New Zealand. So when you look at any major religion, the values of do not kill, go to the 10 Commandments and about loving each other and being honest, social justice, and all that kind of things. Those are Islamic values, Christian values, Jewish values, Buddhist values, and so on. So as I say, and apparently not many countries actually practice that. None of them can be found in any Muslim majority countries. And that, I was asked actually by one of our eminent scholars, he said, Dewi, can you try to find out why is it that Islamic values are only practiced in Scandinavia and New Zealand? So I have to have a disclaimer here. I'm not a learned scholar on Islam, so my life in my hand, I could be accused of blasphemy, but I'm sure that, I'll be protected here. When we are talking about Islamic values, there have been always debates throughout the history, as long as Islam has been around, especially what constitutes Islamic values, not in the sense of relations between a person, man and woman, and his maker or her maker, but in the relations between Islam, Abdun minan nas, the relations between humans. That's what the debate. So the debate's not about the Tawhid, but about relations of Islam to public life. And these debates continue to rage throughout the Muslim world to the present day. As we know that since the very beginning, there has not been one Islamic truth. The moment the Prophet died, there's already been debates about the interpretations of Islam. We have one Quran, unlike the New Testaments, there are so many different versions. There's only one Quran, but hadiths and tafsirs, there are so many of them. And from the very beginning, we have divisions within Islam, besides the Sunni versus Shias. Within the Sunni, we have the schools of thought, the Shafi'i, the Hanbali, the Hanafi, the Maliki. And how they see fundamental things are very different from each other. Even how the ablutions, they disagree with each other. The only agreements are about the Rukun Islam, about the 5 principles of Islam and the 6 imams of Islam. Other than that, there are disagreements. Now, in the West, I think the arguments have been won by the secularists that there should be clear separation between church and state after hundreds of years of religious conflicts. But we do not have that luxury in the Islamic world, precisely because Muhammad was not just a prophet, he was also a leader of a community. It was a conquering religion in the beginning. So there are sets of regulations, including about how to deal with inheritance, about how to do trade, about all kind of public lives could be found, the answers in Islam. So the debates from the very beginning have been about whether a state should be based on Islam or not, and if yes, to what extent Islamic teaching should inform legislations. We continue to have debates about whether plural democracy, human rights, and women empowerment are compatible with Islamic values, whether the ideal system of government should be based on nation states or a transnational Islamic caliphate, what should be the definition of jihad in modern time? Is it war against enemies of Islam, i.e. anybody who is considered to be anti-Islam should be fought against? Or is it against your own selfish desires? This debate about jihad continues. Whether women or non-Muslims can be elected as top government leaders. These are all still being played out in many Muslim countries. All of those questions actually are being played out in Indonesia in recent times. When we had a woman who was going to become president the first time, there were debates among the more conservative Muslims, since a woman cannot become an imam in a mixed prayers, she cannot become the president. But the interpretation of what considered Islamic values are not one thing. It's been contested over times and continues to be contested. And in the domestic political context, these legitimation issues continue to be played out by everybody. So in a Muslim society where religion is still very important, as I said, it's very difficult to separate it between private and public here, everybody seeks legitimation through the wars of the verses. So whether you say that democracy, human rights, and women empowerment, women as leaders are Islamic or not Islamic, you go back to the text and you find different interpretations that can support you. So when you're talking about Islamic values in domestic context, it is very clear. The debates are very clear. In the contestations now about those religious extremists, the terrorism who justifies the use of violence in the name of Islam, our efforts now, worldwide effort, not just in Indonesia, but I think also in India and also in the West, we are now trying to mobilize counter-narratives for efforts of counterterrorism and de-radicalizations, also going back to the sources of the teaching of the Prophet. You cannot kill indiscriminately. You cannot commit suicide bombing. That jihad in modern times means something else, and so on. So, as I say, Islamic values can be identified when you're talking in this domestic context. Now, the question is, can we see similar debates about Islamic values in the formulation of foreign policy of predominantly Muslim countries? So I found the paper that you write, the chapter entitled Islamic Values in Foreign Policy, Perspectives on Secular Turkey and Islamic Iran, to be extremely interesting, very fascinating about, whether it matters. And in that chapter, the authors write that secular Turkey, which has a constitution that clearly says that Islam should not inform politics, increasingly, especially since AKP and Erdogan came to power, has essentialized Islam either to project Turkey as a Muslim power among other Muslim countries, or to have a more Islam-sensitive foreign policy, the use of dinayat and everything, sympathy for the oppressed Muslims everywhere. But other than that, it's just real politics. Now, in Iran, you mentioned about the Islamization of the political language and the portrayal of the United States as a great Satan using an Islamic term. But otherwise, there is no clear difference between the Pahlavi foreign policy and the current Iranian foreign policy, i.e. its geopolitics. So, and that means that there is really no, one cannot really see how Islamic values are even debated in foreign policy. Now, Indonesia, as the largest Muslim majority nation, we have more Muslims in Southeast Asia actually than in the Middle East. It's predominantly Muslim. Indonesia, in fact, shares more similarity with Turkey than with Iran, obviously. Now, Indonesia has as its national ideology Pancasila, the 5 principles. Pancasila is a Sanskrit term. It is not explicitly a secularist ideology, because the first principle of Pancasila is belief in one God. It's monotheism. But being Indonesia, and I listened to Mr. Varma this morning, that we can be anything, because belief in one God, you can be Buddhist, you can be Hindus. As long as you believe in a certain religion, it doesn't matter what your religion is, but the state has responsibility to protect religious freedom. Now, Islam has not really informed politics for a long time, because particularly under the Suharto period, political Islam was very much prohibited. So the only policy that could be identified as Islamic is in the sense of your chapter about Islam-sensitive foreign policy, i.e., for example, support for the Palestinian struggle throughout the New Order period. But if you go back to the language of the foreign policy makers in Indonesia, support for Palestinian has always been there since the Bandung Conference and so on. It's not about Islamic solidarity, it's about decolonization. So it is considered to be a leftover of the decolonization struggle, which was already talked about in 1955 in Bandung, and that is the only one that is left over. To the wider Indonesian public, it's about Muslim solidarity. To the policymakers, it's about decolonization. Now, solidarity for Rohingyas or for the Uyghurs and so on, clearly there is this Islam-sensitive foreign policies. They are much more aroused when there are Muslims being discriminated. But you can say that this is concerns about human rights. And to a certain extent, Indonesia has already embraced the responsibility to protect doctrine since the Reformasi. But interestingly, lately, with the rise of Islamic extremism and how Islam has been abused by a few groups, and as a consequence, the whole Islamic Ummah has been tarred with the brush of this negative publicity. There is now a desire in Indonesia to project Islamic values that has been practiced in Indonesia. So the tagline in Indonesia, particularly since our democratic transformation, is that Indonesia is a country where Islam, democracy, modernity, and women empowerment walk hand in hand. So there is now a clear attempt also to promote religious moderation or moderate Islam. It's called the Wasatiyah Islam, Islam of the middle road, or the middle path, where understanding of Islam should be contextualized. So while in the past, Indonesia and Southeast Asia had tended to be rather lacking in self-confidence. We are at the periphery of the Islamic Ummah. We take our cue from the Middle East. Now, given the problems that there is now, they decide, there is a different narrative of what Islam is about. So in that sense, Islamic value is becoming quite an important attempt, not at foreign policy as much as public diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting take on Indonesia. Now, can I call upon Talmiz Ahmad to come and speak to us?
Thank you.
Oh. Good, fascinating.
आगे कैसे जाएगा? ये? Madam Chairman, fellow co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to compress into 15 minutes 1400 years of Islamic history. I have defined my title as referring to Islam's political values rather than the ethical and the normative and the doctrinal. The first slide refers to what I have understood to be the basic premises relating to Islamic tradition and the way they impact on the shaping of so-called Islamic values. The first proposition is that there is no such thing as an Islamic position with regard to values relating to statecraft and governance. There has been a tremendous debate on these subjects all through 1400 years. The reality is that in this period of 1400 years, no Islamic state was ever a theocratic state. There was always a deep divide between the Sultan and the ulama. The Sultan enjoyed huge spaces of autonomy. War, diplomacy, commerce, and criminal justice were his preserve. Occasionally, the ulama would give him advice. But the tradition of Islam has been that the Sultan has always superseded the ulama in this regard. There have been all the documents relating to Islamic governance are effectively secular documents and refer to values of governance and statecraft. There are similar treatises in government in Islamic realm, in Persian and in Arabic, similar to what we had from Chanakya and several centuries before Machiavelli. The principles that are broadly Islamic in terms of their impact on administration are as follows. Adl or justice, shura, consultation, maslaha, public welfare, concerns relating to fitna or chaos, and finally the principle of expediency. While all the first three principles refer to positive aspects, there is an overwhelming concern, particularly from the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, following the Mongol depredations, that chaos is the worst thing that can happen in a Muslim realm, and that an autocratic ruler is better than having chaos. Historically, these principles have been asserted. They have been asserted by rulers, and they have been asserted against rulers. So the right of rebellion has been given to the people if they find that the ruler does not rule according to these principles. They provide the basis for wide-ranging reform, demands for reform. As political Islam was shaped in the 19th century, these were the principles that scholars had derived from 1400, at that time, 1200 years of Islam. They are today the foundation stones for contemporary political Islam. We have examples of three states, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey, that have attempted to marry their Islamic identity with their foreign policy. Saudi Arabia challenged the rise of Nasser with his secularism, socialism, and nationalism with the principles of Islam. And after 67, the balance of influence shifted in Saudi favor. And therefore, Saudi anchored its influence in the Muslim world on the basis of organizing the community, on the platform of the organization of the Islamic Conference that had its first summit in 1969. Saudi Arabia has relentlessly used Islam to expand its influence in Muslim communities in different parts of the world. It was challenged in 1979 by the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the occupation of Haram Sharif in Mecca, and then attempted to refurbish its Islamic credentials by first challenging the Islamic Revolution and painting it as a Shia revolution, and then effecting certain norms and values at home which would uphold their unique Wahhabiyya or their own affiliation with Wahhabi tenets. But in actual practice, there is very little of Wahhabi doctrine in the public discourse. Wahhabiyya is primarily used as an instrument of coercion to manage and to manage public discourse through controlling the conduct of people in the public square. Iranian revolution was projected as an Islamic revolution. There was no sectarian context to the revolution when it was projected. It has constitutionally set up a number of institutions that would uphold the Islamic character of the republic. Clerical domination is also an integral part of the constitution. But because of the experience of the Iran-Iraq war and the need to end it on the basis of advice from politicians and generals, the idea of Wilayat-e-Faqih was developed. It is a very broad idea. It has several ramifications, but one of them is expediency. That means the principle of expediency can supersede some of the tenets of Sharia. Iran has used the identity of Islam relentlessly to shape the idea of resistance. Therefore, it has reached out strongly to both Hezbollah and to Hamas in this regard. Turkey constitutionally is a secular state, but religion is an integral part of its society. From the 70s, its military leaders started using the language of Islam to espouse, quote-unquote, moderate Islam as part of American interests in order to promote solidarity with the Americans. But Turgut Özal, the Prime Minister, empowered communities through economic reform that had not been empowered before in small towns. These were very strongly anchored in Islam. And that is how Islam entered the broad public discourse. And you had the emergence of Islam for the first time politically through the Rafah Party, which lasted just for 1 year and was overthrown by the armed forces. But since then, from 2002, we have a robustly Islamic government in power. What does Islam mean in terms of foreign policy today? Islam, the affiliation with Islam, provides legitimacy to the rulers and encourages them to expand their influence abroad. This responds to a broad understanding of domestic opinion. The Palestine issue, therefore, resonates across the Islamic world and is seen as an Islamic issue in most Muslim communities. And therefore, even if certain rulers might wish to distance themselves from the Palestinian cause, the sense that this is a popular issue at home across the communities would make them think twice in this regard. Erdogan also has projected a robust interest as a hero figure among Muslims because he stood up to Shimon Peres at Davos in 2006. Certain causes are supported as Islamic causes, and popular support is mobilized in their favor because they are Islamic. But this, as I have noted, is done selectively. Palestine is an obvious example. In its time, there was Bosnia. And of course, there was Chechnya until the Russians made it clear that they did not want any further discussion. So the Chechnya, which used to be a Muslim issue, now then became a terrorism issue. Kashmir is also selectively projected by certain countries as an Islamic cause. Certain choices that certain countries make, certain options that they adopt, and certain policies they pursued are also done in the name of Islam. So, for example, Saudi Arabia shaped the idea of the Shia crescent. Initially, it came from King Abdullah of Jordan. The idea that the Shia communities influenced by Iran are ranged against the Sunni is an instrument of mobilization against co-religionists from another sect. Similarly, with regard to Syria, their head of state was identified as an Alawi and therefore Shia, and therefore you could mobilize support against him, as also in the case of the Houthis. But Islam is above all very frequently used as an ideology. When we mobilized support as part of the Cold War confrontation against the Soviet Union, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan built up the idea of the global jihad and attracted Muslim communities from all parts of the world on the basis of this jihad against godless communism. But also we have seen the other thing happen, that whenever it suits state interest, certain countries from time to time have supported extremists. When we had the Shia empowerment in Iraq, we found the Gulf states actively supporting jihad against Shia empowerment as well. And of course, many Americans were hurt in the process as well. Pakistan has made the use of jihad an instrument of state policy. And Turkey too today, in the context of the Syrian uprising, opened a jihadi superhighway and allowed 30,000 radicals to enter Syria through the Turkish border. Islam has also provided the facility to set up robust and very successful lobby groups in different countries that would support your interest whenever required. They could be made available for your interest. So very often, Iran, for example, has built up Shia militia in Iraq, which are instruments of its policy and ensure that Shia empowerment and its own influence remain intact. Saudi Arabia, in a counter move, is putting together an Islamic NATO, mobilizing Sunni countries from different parts of the world to participate in a military operation against Iran, if the need arises. But so far, there has been no takers, and you have in Rahil Sharif a general without an army. The most effective use of Islam and its tenets and values has been made by non-state actors, by jihadi forces. They have understood Islamic traditions in ways unique to them and quite separate from the Islamic mainstream. They are the ones who are the most effective instruments of Islam today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very, very interesting panel discussion. And before I open this particular discussion to you, there is a question I'd like to ask the panel. Moderate Islam is capable of blunting the narrative of Islam or Islamist extremism, and it's known as Islamic soft power. What I'd like to know is, what do you think? Which country is the most skillful user of Islamist soft power? Shall I give it to you?
Sure. Thank you. Like all things deal with Islam or any ideology, moderate Islam is also not one single thing. So the AKP, for the better part of its existence, has actually used moderate Islam and moderate Islam as a soft power, both domestically and abroad, very, very effectively to penetrate not only the areas that used to belong to the Ottoman Empire at one point of time, but also to areas where it never had any previous presence. So the Turkish presence in Latin America is an early 21st century phenomenon. But that is one particular reading of moderate Islam, which many moderate Muslims will be very offended by if it's labeled as moderate Islam. There are forces in Iran, there are forces in Saudi Arabia, there are forces in Egypt who sort of raise the banner of moderate Islam. It is argued against them that many of them are actually closet secularists. They embrace the language of moderate Islam because that's the only language you can speak with impunity. There are others who genuinely believe that Islam should be made moderate because it has been made extremist. Islam is not something that is given. Islam is what Muslims make of it. And for such people, moderate Islam can certainly blunt extremism. It's just that the social and economic context in which radical Islam flourishes has not really changed. So until that happens, I suspect moderate Islam has an uphill task, but they're there.
Thank you. Can I ask you, Talmiz, if you would like to...
May I respond to this?
Yes, do, please.
The term moderate Islam is a construct that emerged after 9/11. At that time, in his wisdom, George Bush saw the world in terms of good Muslims and bad Muslims. If you were good Muslim, then you were moderate. But you were all of you first bad Muslims until you proved you were good. There is no such thing as moderate Islam. Islam is a doctrine. It is a faith. It is a faith followed by 1.3 billion people. There are individuals within Islam who espouse a violent discourse impelled by their understanding of certain aspects of their faith, and their understanding not just of faith, but of politics, contemporary politics. So they use the tenets of their faith and the justification that are provided by their faith, and then inflict violence upon those they judge to be their enemies. This is not unique to Islam. Please do recall it emerges from the shared messianic belief which is common to the three Semitic traditions, where there is a sanction to use violence against your enemy because your enemy has been identified as Satan. He is satanic, so he is pure evil and you are pure good. And the good Lord in his wisdom has justified the violence that you inflict upon the other. The other is evil and satanic. This is what Israel does. This is the justification for the extraordinary violence that Israel inflicts upon other people. This is the violence that justified George Bush in bombing Iraq in 2003, killing 100,000 people in the process. No jihadi has killed as many people as the messianic zeal of Israel and the United States.
Thank you for that. Jyoti, would you like to
Yeah,
comment
I
on
have a slightly different take. I mean, Indonesia being, as I said, the world's largest Muslim majority country, the debates about Islam and culture, about society, has been ongoing. I come from West Sumatra, which is matrilineal. In the early 19th century, people have been going on the Hajj for a long time. A group of ulamas came back, they're called the Padri. That was in the early 19th century, and they decided that being matrilineal is un-Islamic. So they killed the queen, they destroyed the monarchy in West Sumatra, and then the traditional leaders called the Dutch in. Sounds familiar?
Yes.
Yeah. And so now we have Islam, Khitabullah, at the top, but anything that is not against Islamic, i.e. matrilinealism, is not mentioned in the Quran. So we continue to have ongoing matrilinealism, and the contestation continues. So this is not something new. But within Indonesia, as you know, why we chose Pancasila in the end is because there's a group of Islamists. So when we talk about Islamists, are those who want Islam to be the basis of the state. So otherwise, it's just Islamic. It's not Islamist. That's where we're very critical and use that. So there have been war against the Indonesian state by people long before Al-Qaeda came along who wanted to establish an Islamic state in Indonesia. And the majorities who believe that since Indonesia is a very pluralistic nation, 87% of people are Muslims, but we have Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, and so on. We need to have a nation state.
Thank you very much.
So I would not agree that the moderate only comes, to be a discourse after 9/11.
Thank you very much for this. And now I'm going to open it up to all of you. I'd like to see lots of hands and lots of questions. One. Yes, please.
Okay, my question is to Professor Anwar. Well, that was a very interesting presentation, in fact, interesting presentation from all the panelists. You did touch upon a responsibility to protect. So, well, of course, it is a responsibility to protect of the state itself, right, to protect the citizens or the population. But what is the take, Indonesia's take in terms of external involvement or involvement of international community in the context of responsibility to protect? That's one. Secondly, in the context of women empowerment and Islam, what is the present status of women's education and their political representation and role in policy making in Indonesia? Thank you. I'm Dr. Bharti Chibba, teaching at University of Delhi.
Would you like to respond? Please tell me.
The question was to her, I think.
Is it to you?
Yes, yeah. She was
Okay.
asking about Indonesia.
Please proceed.
Yeah, so the responsibility to protect was debated prior to Indonesia's democratization. Of course, Indonesia belonged to this group. I'm sure they're going to talk about ASEAN values and Asian values and so on, who believe that national sovereignty is inviolable. Whatever you do internally, it's nobody's business. And in fact, that has been justified by authoritarian regimes, because it's their business. This is not the positions of civil society. That was never my position in the beginning. So we embrace the concepts of responsibility to protect, that the international community should also care about what is happening internally. Then Indonesia and all the way ASEAN, so it's not just Indonesia, took the responsibility to protect doctrine to persuade Myanmar during the Nagis typhoon, when Myanmar refused to open up to the outside help. And I said, you better allow ASEAN to come in, otherwise ASEAN may allow the UN to invoke the responsibility to protect, so that was used instrumentally, and so on. Women empowerment, we have a lot of advances, but problems remain. We have never discriminated, that is one thing about coming to be through a revolution. There's never been a legalized discriminations against women, but there are cultural differences. So I do not think that we can really say, it's like in India, there's a lot of advancement. You have your prime minister who is a woman, and we have a president who's a woman. You look at the cabinet, there's a lot of women, but there are also, class things, middle class and people who are from the marginal communities and so on. So it's mostly cultural impediments rather than state legalistic impediments to women's advancement.
Thank you very much.
Could I respond about women?
Certainly.
About women, the scenario is mixed. But West Asia is going through major changes. They are slow and not satisfactory, but there is a sensitivity. There's a sensitivity from the rulers themselves because they want to look good in the international community. They want to be part of the mainstream of international life. And there is a pressure from women themselves. Just to illustrate this from Saudi Arabia, where we have in the shape of Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a reformer, he has focused a lot on women. And he has allowed women to drive, a very unique disability that only Saudi women have experienced. But there are serious problems within the kingdom, that even though women are allowed to drive, there are still various constraints with regard to other aspects of Arabiya that influences social life. That is gender segregation, restrictions on movement of women, and modesty of dress. Many of these have restricted their employment. Saudi women in the Arab world are perhaps the most accomplished of all, and yet they suffer the most unique disabilities. When they assert human rights, the same Prince Mohammed bin Salman has locked up 5 of them in prison They were the pioneers of human rights activism on behalf of women. But the great success story has come from Tunisia. After the Arab Spring, the Tunisian constitution is just one line, says men and women are equal. Morsi's constitution under the Muslim Brotherhood had a very convoluted phraseology, which says that men and women are different and they should fulfill their different role in life, and women should uphold the dignity and of the family and the honor of the family. It's a paragraph which went on. It didn't do much for women. The Tunisian is just one line. So things are changing, perhaps for women not fast enough, and there are very often voices which would express dissatisfaction. But I want to make one more point. Do remember that these are traditional societies still. So you have a vanguard that is very modern and progressive, but overwhelmingly communities tend to be very traditional, and the disabilities of women are not so much religious as cultural.
Can we have a mic here, please? You? Did you want to ask a question? No, next to you. No. And over there.
Thank you. We spoke a lot this morning about the need for tolerance. And I just wondered how that fitted in with Islamic values.
Tolerance, the need for tolerance?
Which one of you want to take?
Islamic scholarship. If I were to be very categorical, I would say it's very difficult to come up with a categorical reply. Because tolerance, there is a doctrinal support for tolerance. Some liberal, moderate reform Muslims, regardless of when you consider the term to have been coined, there are people who espouse Islamic values and advise moderation, and they argue that so long as non-Muslims accept an Islamic order, there is full protection of Jan, Mal, Deen, Man, that is to say your life, your property, your faith, and your dignity. And that is used by a number of votaries of democracy in the Muslim world to argue for equal rights for Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Except that the basket cases of Islamic politics have not always had the advantage of such moderation triumphing. As a result, there is an optical illusion that Islam is incompatible with religious tolerance. As I was saying, that Islam is neither this nor that. It's neither tolerant nor intolerant. It depends more on the society. If the people in the society find tolerance to be broadly beneficial, then tolerance prevails. Where that does not happen, and that's true for many of the basket cases of radical Islam, not radical Islam, Islamic traditionalism, such as Afghanistan. It seems that Islam has a problem with tolerance, and sometimes Muslim societies are found to be divided within. So Pakistan is a very good example, where traditionalism has become more and more ascendant. Traditionalism of a more socially conservative kind, and a modernist reading of Islam, which had earlier prevailed, has, because of a socio-economic churning, begun to be weakened. So, as I said, there is no categorical answer to this except to point out that theoretically, tolerance has been given, as has been accommodated within the possibility of, within the horizon of possibilities in the Muslim world. But ultimately, you might say that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So I'm saying, wait a little, the pudding is still being made.
Tanveez, would you like to give a short answer to that? Would you like to address that?
Again, we use the word Islam when we mean Muslims. This is the only faith where we conflate the faith with the people. No other, we do not use this terminology for any other community. The record with regard to Islam is confusing, complex. Overall, I would say, except for Saudi Arabia, most Muslim states tend to be accommodative. Most Muslim states tend to be accommodative in terms of their constitution and in terms of practice. But what we have seen is when there is a crisis, particularly a political crisis, then some of the visceral animosities of communities emerge, like we saw hostility to the Coptic community in Egypt in a certain context, though it is not the Egyptian habit. But such attacks on other communities during times of political crisis, domestic political crisis, happens across the board. It's not unique to Islam and can happen in any community when there is a crisis. Overall, the trend is to be more accommodative. I would say many of the Gulf Arab countries have shown remarkable accommodation. Many of the West Asian countries, as also Turkey, have shown accommodation. The negative image is due to the aberrant conduct of the Islamic State, of Al-Qaeda, of Taliban particularly. So that is there. But I think overall we are getting there. Even with regard to Saudi Arabia, as you know, the Mohammed bin Salman has spoken of tolerance and accommodation of different faiths, though we have not yet seen evidence of that in terms of having places of worship of other communities set up, as you have in all the other Gulf countries.
Jyoti, would you like to give a very quick comment, please?
Yeah. For the scholars of Islam, they go back to the Medina constitution, the Prophet in the setting of Medina, where Islam is in the ascendant, but there's recognition and respect for the peoples of the books. So Christians and Jews were respected and were protected, although not necessarily in the same level in terms of status. And if you look at history, the Islam in Spain, there was a flourishing of very, very cosmopolitan and very tolerant society, and throughout the early, the Ottoman Empire also. But the record is very, very mixed now. When you go to Indonesia, where would you go? As the largest Muslim majority country, you think of Indonesia as Borobudur, Bali, and so on. The Hindus and Buddhists, all of those temples remain very protected. So that has been what Indonesia has been like, what has made it possible. But increasingly, there's worrying trend of intolerance also, where the language of intolerance coming from Western Asia, where the conflicts in Western Asia are also sometimes being played in. We have never had any consciousness about Sunni-Shia divide. Indonesia has good relations with both Tehran and Saudi Arabia. No concept at all of that Sunni-Shia divide. But lately, that issues also come to being, so that the small minority of Shias in Indonesia, came into persecution. But I don't think that was really, part of our religious culture.
Thank you very much. Can we have you?
Yes, please. Could I ask a question on political theory, on your idea of the definition of sovereignty in Islamic political thinking, under the rubric of Islamic political thinking? Because sovereignty would belong to God, of course. God is sovereign. It's a sacred trust given unto the people. In that case, in the modern state system, how would Islamic nations, so Islam majority nations, bring the Westphalian concept of states in consonance with the Islamic political thinking?
Yes. You've raised the right question, because there is a lot of confusion on this subject. As you know, Islam, in terms of doctrine, did not provide political theory. It had issues relating to statecraft, but not to political theory. So what we've done is, with very great effort, attempted to draw certain norms of political theory. Many of the Islamic states were, in that sense, no different from contemporary Western states in Europe. They were almost identical, with the divide between religious authority and the Sultan. And as you know, in the case of Western societies, the rule of the clergy was even more powerful at times, and the clergy, that kind of parallel we did not have. The issue of sovereignty has emerged in the context of political Islam, particularly where you have jihadi discourse only jihadi discourse has spoken of hakimiyya. Hakimiyya means God's sovereignty, where the Lord is hakim. And therefore you have the sovereignty of the divine, and therefore you cannot have a man-made constitution, and you cannot have a constitution which has the people as sovereign. So this is hakimiyya. Hakimiyya is not originally, though there are references to hakimiyya as God is our overlord, etc., which is there, it has actually emerged from South Asia. And it is said that Ali Miah is the one who originated this idea, where he said that we live in an age of ignorance and we need to go back to hakimiyya. Maulana Maududi picked up this idea and it has entered jihadi mainstream. So hakimiyya has now become the fifth tenet of jihadi discourse. When they think in terms of the state, they don't think in terms of state, they think in terms of society. As you know, in jihadi discourse there is no state. But as you know, in Islamic tradition of 1400 years, we've had state, but we didn't call them state, we called them empires. Post First World War, where Muslim states have emerged, Arab states have emerged, they were all of them constructed by the colonialists, and they have remained intact. And all the borders that were created after Versailles are intact, and they are now nation states.